Ready? Okay. Good morning. Thanks everybody for coming out on a Monday morning at 8:30, fighting road construction, UNLV parking. Apparently there's an accident at Tropicana in Maryland, so congratulations, you made it. My name is David Demore. I'm the Executive Director of the Lindsay Institute in Brookings Mountain West at UNLV. Don't have to tell anybody in this room, but obviously coming out of COVID-19, probably one of the most salient, if not the most salient issue in Nevada and nationally is, of course, housing. Everybody's talking about it. Last week, I was back in Washington, D.C. for the Vegas Chambers fly-in. We heard from all 6 of our members of our delegation, and they all talked about housing and land, obviously, as well. If you saw the Las Vegas Sun over the weekend, Representative Dina Titus had a piece on housing as well. So this is certainly something out there, but it's also a very, very complex issue, as we're going to learn about today. Housing, of course, crosses the jurisdictions of the federal government, state governments, local governments. It's impacted by multiple regulatory regimes, including land use, insurance, lending practices, and increasingly the commodification of properties. It has implications for our transportation systems, our education systems, and of course, where we end up having our jobs and economic diversification efforts in Southern Nevada. At the family level, it of course protects and shelters those we love, and it contributes to the health and well-being of families in our communities, and is a key mechanism to create intergenerational wealth and facilitate economic mobility. So we're not going to, of course, solve all these issues today, but our goal is here to understand the factors that have created our current situation and to evaluate how we can do better moving forward. So our plan for the next 2 hours or so is in your program. Here we're going to have 3 presentations of original research. You'll be the first people seeing this research, each tapping different dimensions of our housing policy and current housing challenges there. We'll then have 2 panels, one on housing finance, the other on housing access there. And again, the agenda here will have the bios of everybody. We won't spend a lot of time doing introductions here, so you can learn about who your participants are today here. Before we get started, a couple of thank yous on our side. Of course, Caitlin Saladino and Ashley Clare pulling this together, as well as Bill Brown. And I want to acknowledge Aaron Klein, who did great work bringing this together as well from Brookings Economic Studies. Thank you so much, Aaron. And of course, our partners at UNLV TV who are recording this event. Later, once we get the recording, we will send the link out as well as a recap of today's event. Before we get to our first presentation, however, I want to we have a brief message from someone you may recognize, our senior senator, Catherine Cortez Masto.
Hello, this is U.S. Senator Catherine Cortez Masto. I want to start by thanking Brookings Mountain West and the Lindsay Institute at UNLV for their more than 15 years of working to bring independent and important research to public policy discussions in Nevada. And thank you to Executive Director Dr. David Demore for your leadership and for inviting me to participate today. As we all know, we are in the middle of an affordable housing crisis. My priority has always been to build up our affordable housing and ensure that every Nevadan who wants to own a home gets that opportunity. In the Senate, I have been working to pass legislation to modernize the Home Investment Partnerships Program, to fund infrastructure improvements in manufactured home communities, and to bolster the low-income housing tax credit. I also work to make sure that the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco stepped up and started contributing their fair share for affordable housing in Nevada. And I'm always fighting to cut through red tape and make it easier to build homes that Nevadans can afford. So as you examine the various aspects of Nevada's housing policy landscape today, know that I am your partner on this issue. Together, we can end the housing shortage in Nevada and really across the country. So thank you.
So our first presentation this morning will be by our colleagues at Lead Institute of Real Estate, Shawn McCoy, Nicholas Irwin, and we'll be talking about investor and affordability in the housing market. And this is a very smart analysis because they put their data at the context of the state legislative district.
Thanks, David. Thank you all. Just before I start, I want to thank everyone for coming down to talk about housing. This is the time to talk about housing, and looking in this room, seeing everyone so vested, thinking carefully about these public policy issues. let's take a big step back by taking a giant step forward for a moment. And I'd like to think, what are we going to be thinking about the 2022, 2023, more broadly, post-COVID marketplace for multifamily housing? If you're a real estate economist in the 3020s as opposed to the 2020s, in particular, what would you think about this time period if you started by looking at a trend in multifamily rent? Hopefully, stories like this won't be forgotten. Surging egg prices, interest rates, 16-year relative highs, inflation, again, at relatively high, unprecedented levels, again, in a recent historical context. But this really wasn't the question. The question was, what would you think if you started here? This is a trend in multifamily rent for Southern Nevada. And in contrast to some of the headlines that we see, rising rental cost burden, rising renter cost burden, out of control housing costs, when we look at the data, this is what we're talking about. 2022, 2023, a period of relatively stable, if not falling rent. It doesn't matter what data set you pick, Moody's, this comes from CoStar, you're going to see something like this. And it raised some questions to us at Lead Center for Real Estate. When we look at the trend, if anything, rents fell. And in fact, you'll see headlines capturing what happened in this time period, like this one. Why Las Vegas rents are plummeting. This is 2023. And this has created a bit of a conundrum for us because those in housing policy knew that it wasn't a stable period. It was a period of turmoil in the housing market and a period where renters indeed became increasingly cost burdened, and homeowners and renters alike really felt the strain of housing. Rents did fall. They fell precipitously beginning in 2022, moving into 2023, and only until relatively recently did we see rents pick back up. That pickup you're seeing near the end, a little bit of that, many in this space attribute to difficulties you're seeing in the single-family market. Home ownership becoming increasingly more unattainable, propping up rental demand in the multifamily space. What if we, though, go back to the data and pull data at the building level as opposed to the market level? And this is the first thing we did, is we aggregated median rent by zip code. And then we partitioned zip codes based on zip codes that witnessed rising rent versus falling rent over this 2022-2023 time period. And the first thing that popped out is that when rents were relatively stable, but a $5 difference between these two time periods. What we found in the data, rents were up in 58% of zip codes, and they were down in 42%. It was almost an even split of neighborhoods seeing rising rent and neighborhoods witnessing falling rent. This raises some questions. Where is this happening? Why is this happening? What are the concerns? And one way of getting at this is just to start with a map of median rent by zip code in Clark County, Nevada. So what you're looking at here is the distribution of median rent by zip code close of 2021 Q4. This is the rent level. This is going to be a good Kodak moment in a second. This is what we know about rental housing in Southern Nevada. High rent in the urban fringe, relatively low rent near the middle of our landscape. So again, these are our high rent neighborhoods. I'm gonna show you on the next map how this map looks if instead of visualizing the distribution of rent, the change in rent moving into 2022. And it flips. Everyone see that? I'll go back and forth for a second. The maps completely invert, almost nearly perfectly invert. And what we found is that indeed, rents on average tended to decrease in once high rent areas and tended to increase in areas where rents were pre-existingly at lower levels. That distribution of rent change, we show, tracks the income distribution, giving rise to the headline we saw in the RJ, rents dropping in rich areas, rising in poor areas. And so a lot of mechanisms explain what was going on in this particular time period. Distortions in supply, land costs were quite expensive, pushing new multifamily supply, targeting that upper end of that rental ladder, Class A, luxury apartment development. But also this idea of moving down the housing ladder. As the market gets expensive, renters are in relative terms more mobile than homeowners and can combat this affordability crisis by vacating once high rent units, sorting down that ladder into once low price units, creating an imbalance in supply and demand that gives rise to the pattern of data that you see. And I think in terms of the takeaways, by the way, 2022 was also a time period when Nevada was flagged and became the second highest excessively cost burden state for renters in the entire United States. A period of falling rent and stabilized rent at the metro level. And there is a very large gap in the optics, right? When you look at the data, you can tell one story, but what's happening behind the scenes down to the neighborhood level, something very, very, very different was going on. The main takeaway is that aggregated trends can tell the story of a market, but very rarely can they tell the story of an individual homeowner. And for those that work in public policy, what really matters to us isn't how things average out at the metro level, but who is being hurt and who needs assistance. That's really what this is all about. And one thing we learned about the data in 2022, 2023, is that the time for moving away from thinking about large metro level analysis is now. And telling these stories requires a very careful consideration of space. This is a map that we produced in conjunction with Wes Rand from the RJ. This is a high resolution heat map showing you exactly where rent is increasing and exactly where multifamily rent was decreasing in 2023 Q4.
The red's increasing?
Correct. That's correct. Talk about investor purchases. I could show you a map like this, demonstrating that in 2023, approximately 22% of homes were purchased by single-family investors. I could show you that map, or I could show you a map and plot all of them and show you where the hot spots are. And you'd realize very quickly that, again, not all neighborhoods are created alike. When you look at the data, it helps explain why when you walk into some neighborhoods, each red dot represents a single-family investor purchase home. Helps explain why some neighborhoods have this experience, some neighbors have this experience, and some have this experience. Mortgage default rates are at historically low levels. We're going to talk about the Adam reports documenting this uptick, this relative uptick. But regardless of the uptick, and Nevada ranks pretty high in terms of that recent trend, regardless of the uptick, the punchline here is much like we saw with 2022, 2023 multifamily, these foreclosure rates, mortgage default rates are relatively low. But in Southern Nevada, if you go and plot the location of every property in default, you're going to realize that they are low in most areas, but not everywhere. About 5 hotspot concentrations, about 5 neighborhoods account for over half of all notice of default NODs in Clark County. And once again, back to this broad theme of using space as a consideration for housing policy, all of this variation is getting washed out and averaged out in the data when we look at aggregated trends. All this to say, we need to think about geography, but it raises a second order question. What levels of geography matter? What levels of geography help? And where should we be steering the research to so we can make more informed housing policy decisions? I'm going to turn it over to Professor Nick Irwin. It's going to share some insights and approaches thinking about what type of geography we may consider. Nick, take it away.
Thanks, Shawn. So we can get good data. We know when a house transacts. We know where that house is located within the city. So we can get property level data. We know if that house goes into foreclosure, we can get data on that. And using the census data, we can pull in information about what's the socio-demographic makeups of an area. How many people in that neighborhood speak English as their first language, their second language? What's the education level? And then we can aggregate that up even further to state level. Everything here on the left side are data that we have, it's information that we have pretty good data on that we see a lot. On the other side, zip codes, we report a lot of data on zip codes because when people are shopping for houses, they think of that as kind of a neighborhood. For example, if you go on Zillow and you're looking at houses, you sometimes can put in a neighborhood, but oftentimes you put in a zip code, 89052, 89114, because that's the area in which you're looking. Data on that from the census doesn't publish data on zip codes, or certainly not at the level that we want, same information we get being a census tract. At a city level, it becomes even more complex. Because cities, what can cities do? Cities can grow. Cities' boundaries change. So having a stable boundary over time makes it very difficult to get out stable units that we can evaluate changes in the underlying market that matter for important things like understanding how to address housing affordability. Another area, if we're thinking about how we can translate what we know about geography, an easy thing we can do using our data tools is to map everything into our state legislative districts. This is the assembly districts for Clark County. Zoomed in on the city, so some of the bigger districts on the outside aren't here, but we could call these neighborhoods. These can be units of observation. We can take that same data that we know at the property level, we can aggregate it up, and we can report that same information inside these legislative districts. Why would we want to do that? Well, we have a part-time legislature in this state, and the folks that are working in legislature, they may not have the capability or the data tools necessary to understand what's going on inside their markets. We, Shawn and I, folks at the Lead Center, real estate economists, we have those tools to be able to translate what's happening at that metro level into what's happening in the individual districts. So if we have stuff at the property level, it's fairly easy to do, but if we have things that don't necessarily line up really well, for example, zip codes, they don't always line up well with assembly district or legislative, with assembly or senate district boundaries. Census tracts may not line up perfectly. So how can we take data that may only be available at a census tract and convert it back to those legislative districts? Well, here's an example of how we can do that. If we want to look at what's the average rate of mortgage denial in a district, we can get that data from HMDA. The Home Mortgage Disclosure Act reports data every year on the universe of people who've applied for mortgages. So that data is anonymized in a way that it just reports it at the tract level. But it reports a wealth of important information. It reports information on the debt-to-income ratio of each applicant. It reports the outcome, were they denied? If they were denied, what were the reasons they were denied? It reports information on the property value, on the loan amount, on the interest rate if it converts into a loan, and also important information on how and who is part of that mortgage. What are their racial and ethnicities? Are they married? Do they have a co-filer? So if that data is reported in tracts, we can take that information and develop what we call a mortgage denial density service by aggregating that data up, knowing that there are a certain number of housing units inside that mortgage, and then using this heat map effectively, we can then map that back into what's happening at the Assembly District or the Senate District or any other unit that we care to analyze. Because we're talking about doing this with mortgage denials, we could do it with anything else, any other data that we think that is important to understand what's happening in the housing market. So taking that, here's a map of housing prices. The darker the color, from going from green being cool, red being hot, the higher the house prices. This is all data from 2023. So this pattern is not too dissimilar from what Shawn showed earlier. In these sort of outlying areas here, we have the highest prices, but inside here, lower prices, and going up into that northeastern part of the city. All right, housing prices is one measure of what's going on, but let's look at cost burden. We can take that same cost burden information that's available at the tract level and map it back into our assembly districts. So here is what happens if we map that back in. The areas with the darkest colors are the areas where they have the highest rent burden. And for those of you that may not have caught that before, that's renters who are using 35% or more of their gross income on rent per month. And knowing that our statewide average is pretty high, you can see there are certain pockets up there, especially we're thinking like, Assembly District 7. 62.1% of renters in that district are cost burden. Cost burden, if you follow out what that means, that also means they're at a higher risk to face eviction in the future. Some job loss, some unexpected expense comes up, they're at a higher risk than someone living, say, over in Summerlin. But still, even though we have the data, you see it's green here, it's still pretty high in the rest of the area. So why do we want this information? Well, if you're an assembly person, say in District 35, you may hear from some constituents that I'm rent burdened or I'm cost burdened or house prices are too high. But if you don't have that true information of what's happening, it's harder for you to make effective policy. Let's look at evictions. Evictions, one of the highest places for evictions is actually one of our biggest districts out here, 8036. That's Indian Springs, Mount Charleston area. And lowest are sort of around that periphery of the city. But inside of the outer belt there, fairly high number of evictions. This is just data from 2023. We haven't started to bring in data from 2024 where we know that evictions are picking up a little bit. We notice the defaults are picking up a little bit. So this map may look very different with updated data. Investor purchases, something we all care about. Who's buying the homes in these neighborhoods? Well, there's a lot of investor purchases happening in 2023. Looking at about 27% of all purchases were made by investors, or what we would deem investors from our data. But there's an interesting issue with that of how do we find investors? Because if you are a company and you decide to purchase a house, depending on who is deeded on the ownership of that house, it could be an LLC that controls one house or 10 houses. Or it could be one company that controls a lot of LLCs that are all individually named, so we and our data wouldn't pick that up unless we cross-reference it with Secretary of State data to really find out who these investors are. Finally, mortgage denial. Thankfully, fairly low in the periphery, but in some of those center parts of the city, 80-28 there, 22.9% of people who applied for a mortgage, almost a quarter of people who applied for a mortgage in 2023 were denied. A lot of reasons they could be denied: lack of job history, poor credit, lack of down payment, a variety of issues. We don't delve into that, but this is an area of concern. If people had the means and they want to buy a house, they're not having a lot of luck up in 80-28. So don't think that my folks in the Senate, I've been left out here. We can do the same thing with Senate districts. Senate districts are bigger, so they comprise a couple of different assembly districts, different level of geography, but we can use the same tools. Well, awful lot of red. A little bit of green inside the periphery of the city there. Awful lot of red. House prices have been high. Much higher than they have been at any time in our past. Renter cost burden looks a little differently. We can sort of see where this is concentrated. It's concentrated sort of at the heart of the city, but still pretty high everywhere else. So I feel like I'm boring you with maps. Wait till it, we'll get to it. Rental evictions. You see we still have this big district here, Senate District 19, a lot of evictions, green in a lot of spots. And here's investor purchases. Okay, mortgage denial as well. So showing you a bunch of data, looking at a map, that's one thing. But let's just do some pairwise comparisons between different districts. Let's look at Assembly District 9, Assembly District 7. So if say both of these assembly people came together and they decide, hey, we want to tackle affordable housing. Well, do they have any commonalities? Do they have any differences? Well, one thing they do share is that these are the two assembly districts with the highest levels of investor purchases in 2023. But that's sort of where the similarities end. If you look at Assembly District 9, $659,000 for the average sales price, $380 for Assembly District 7. Wildly different markets, different price points. Renter burden, much higher in Assembly District 7, but owner cost burden, roughly the same. It's below average for the area, even though prices are very different. Debt to income ratio, the folks in Assembly District 7 are much more highly in debt than the folks in Assembly District 9. So what commonalities would these legislators have? They know, okay, we both are facing issues. We both know that we need to do something about housing. Well, what can we do that's going to help one district and help the other when the districts are fundamentally different? The housing market within each district is fundamentally different. It's difficult. What about two of our biggest assembly districts, 36 and 23, spanning all the way from Indian Springs all the way down to the border with California. These are areas that are pretty similar, fairly higher sales prices in these areas, but renter cost burden, very high. Owner cost burden, some of the lowest owner cost burdens in our entire analysis. Mortgage denial rate, also very low. But there's a difference in investor purchases. In the area with a larger number of investor purchases, with our Assembly District 36, owners are less cost burdened. Again, there's difference in these geographies. There's difference in what's happening here. So if we want Danielle Gallant and Gregory T. Haffen to come together and decide what's the best policy that we could implement for our districts to improve housing affordability, well, housing affordability seems to be fairly affordable for folks here, not a really high level of mortgage denial rate, but on the renter cost side, renters are very burdened. So how can you tackle just that renter side? How can you help multifamily without somehow impacting the single family market as well? It's tough to separate those objectives. How about 15 and 28? These are areas that are more sort of in the core of the MSA. And these are areas that have some of the highest levels of owner cost burden. So there's a shared similarity between these districts. And there's some other shared similarities. The renter cost burden is very high, but the eviction rate's much higher in one of the districts compared to the other. So perhaps if Howard Watts was interested in some policy that could address renter cost burden, perhaps evictions, that may not work as well in Assembly District 28 or 36 or any other districts we've been looking at. And that's the difficulty here. How about 14 and 37? These are the areas with the highest mortgage denial rates and the lowest mortgage denial rates. But what's interesting is that even though in District 37 is the highest, these are the lowest levels of mortgage denial rates, its residents, at least those that are applying for mortgages, have the highest debt burden, but they're still able to get mortgages. So what does that say about what's happening inside these districts? Very different in sales prices, but something interesting, the eviction rate, much higher in 14 than it is in 37. So differences between the single family and multifamily housing market. My senators aren't going to escape here either. Let's look at 4 and 9. These are the two areas that have the highest eviction rates. But Senate District 9 is also one of the wealthiest Senate districts in terms of if we're just looking at house prices. But 31.7% of multifamily units experience an eviction notice in that district. But even though we saw a lot of evictions, the owner cost burden in Senate District 9 is about 10 percentage points lower than in 4. What's happening in this district that is causing this? Why are so many evictions being filed, but renters are not nearly as cost burdened? Having this information is helpful for legislators to know what's going on in their districts. And that's the entire goal of this project, was how do we translate this data that we know exists, these big trends that are happening at the city level, into stuff that can be actionable for our policymakers. Final one, 2 and 8. This is the highest sales price district, Senate District 8, and the lowest, Senate District 2. Now, some things that sort of spin out of that naturally is you would expect, okay, perhaps the makeup is different in Senate District 2, so we see a lot higher amount of mortgage denial, but they're not as debt burdened, slightly less debt burdened. And also, owner cost burden, not nearly as, they're about equal. Even though everything else about these districts, very, very different. So coming back to the why are we doing this? So state legislators are facing a renewed calls to do something on housing affordability. We know this is a big issue coming up. We know this has been an issue, and we see it in advertisements. We want to do something. We know our local leaders are working on something. We know our federal leaders are working on something, particularly addressing the federal lands issue. But the state, they want to do something because they're hearing from their constituents. But it's really hard to know what to do or know the real scope or scale of the problem if you don't know what's going on inside your own district. Now, to our knowledge, this data is not available anywhere else. This isn't something that's mass produced, but we're happy to produce it in the aid of helping to shape better policy. Because the bigger the problem, the better the data has to be to help inform policy. We're trying to think of what needs to be done, what needs to be changed. You need to know the data. You need to have the data to allow you to help guide those decisions. And that is at the heart of what we do at the LEAD Center. Here are our recent research reports where we put them out about every 2 months, that we are examining different issues facing Southern Nevada. So we have one on cost burden, thanks to that map that Shawn showed earlier, that we took that data down to the semi-district level. We looked at sort of the rising amount of mortgage defaults, and we looked at what's happening with our new in-state movers. This is particularly interesting looking out here. I'm sure we've heard people say, we see all the California license plates coming in. We see them driving around in town. But did you know that the average California resident who moved into Las Vegas is about 17% richer than an in-state resident? What do you think that means for the housing market? If you look at even more granular detail, the average person coming in from Orange County is about 200% richer than the average person, average non-mover in Clark County. Those people are much better positioned in the housing market. So how do you address that? You can't stop people from California moving in, but maybe there's some other way to think about what to do. So anyone interested in the work that we do, we have our research reports here if you want to scan this, and then we also have our mailing list if you're interested in getting up-to-date information of what happens with our research reports, particularly when we package up this data that we presented today into reports that we are going to provide. So all the legislative leaders and any other interested person could find out what's happening, what's the state of the housing market, at least based on 2023 data, in my district. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nick and, hello? Thank you, Nick and Shawn. Excellent work. Next up, the real person to blame, right? The federal government, Aaron. So next up will be Aaron Klein from Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution. He's going to do a presentation on some work that he and his team were just putting out called Examining Household Inflation Post-COVID.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be back at Brookings Mountain West and getting outside of the DC bubble and having a chance to have a conversation and explain some new research. This is the very first presentation of this paper that is a draft form. I'm hoping to release this in about a couple weeks. I have a curated set of only 15 slides of what's about a 37-page, lots of graphs, lots of details, deeper analysis of what happened in housing post-COVID. Because I think the #1 economic story in America in the kind of COVID recovery period is the inflation story. You're seeing that play out in the presidential election. You're seeing that play out in polling and other pieces of data. And I think when you peel back the onion, this presentation, I hope will convince you of 3 things. #1, the inflation story is deeply intermixed with the price of housing. #2, the price of housing did something different in America than it should have and than the rest of the world. And #3, this has to be related in a way that is underappreciated to the unconventional monetary policy the Federal Reserve took during the COVID crisis. I did this paper with my colleague, Alan McCoy, who's over at Dartmouth, and I want to thank him for his work. And I want to start by talking about Econ 101. And in Econ 101, hopefully we've seen all of this. Fixed supply, demand, there's a price, there's a quantity, and there's a shock. Demand increases. Supply, when it's totally fixed, an increase in demand will translate up to an increase in price. Why do I show this simple graph? Well, in the very short term, the supply of housing is relatively fixed. It takes a while to build a house. Even here in Nevada, where you guys do a fantastic job of building more houses and increasing housing supply, you can't do it overnight. Number two, somehow the central bank, in conducting monetary policy, seems to have walked away from the first graph that hopefully all of you are teaching or have been taught in Econ 101. Because what did the Federal Reserve do? The Federal Reserve changed the demand for housing assets, that is mortgage-backed securities, and we saw a giant increase in price. I'm going to explain how they did that in a second, but I just want to all ground us back in the very beginning of Econ 1. So what happened to housing? And I said at the very beginning, the inflation story is intermingled with housing. This is inflation. This is the inflation boom. And notice a couple things. What you'll notice is housing lags overall inflation. It takes a little while for it to come up. This is a little bit of the story of the toilet paper shortage. Do you guys remember that one? Right? There's an immediate short-term jump in quantity and supply. But what happens starting in 2023? Inflation falls. This is often called team long transitory. The people that said the inflation was driven by supply shocks and other COVID-related things, it was transitory as opposed to permanent, it falls. But when overall inflation is falling, housing inflation is rising, and it has stayed elevated. So that the overall inflation that we're seeing bouncing around 3%, that you see up here, this is the Fed's 2% target. We've actually been at or below the Fed's 2% target for inflation for over a year, excluding housing. But when you include housing, it's a full point of the overall inflation rate from 2% to 3% is just housing, which has remained elevated. And I use two different measures, owner's equivalent rent and tenant rent. It depends if you're renting or the inflation indice tries to estimate what the value of your home is for the price increase if you're an owner, with the mental gymnastics of the cost of your housing is what would happen if I had to rent my house. So this is a different type of inflation that isn't seen. But you'll see inflation currently is a housing story. So let's talk about housing. Okay, so what did the Federal Reserve do? The Federal Reserve, actually, I'll skip one. Let's talk about housing. This is the national median home price. So we've zoomed in from assembly districts in the Las Vegas metro area all around to the national country. And what do you see? You see what economists love, a line of best fit. Dancing right, easy to predict. Boom, COVID happens, wow. House prices skyrocket. And then they kind of stay elevated. That difference from what the trend would be, had we followed the pre-COVID experience, in April 2022, and I picked that date because that's the date the Federal Reserve stopped buying mortgages, right there, was $72,000, right? Roughly, you've seen home prices increase $100,000 from the beginning of COVID, the blue line, to where we are. 3/4 of that unexplained, 1/4 of that would just be trend. And it all happened during that time period from here to that little dashed line in April 22. After that, you can see prices are a little flat. So what was happening during that time period? Well, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates and started buying assets. And what did the Federal Reserve buy? So that graph shows that they bought $1 trillion of assets. You'll see economists love the two y-axis graphs. And so you'll see on the right, they bought $1 trillion of assets there, and then they cut rates. And then they raised rates, but they kind of kept their assets. It's been slowly, very slowly dribbling on. So what did they buy? Correct. The Federal Reserve is legally constrained under Section 14 of the Federal Reserve Act to only buy two things in the conduct of normal monetary policy. They can buy treasuries, they can buy mortgage-backed securities from an agency. That is Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Ginnie Mae. These are basically our mortgages, except if you have a very high-end mortgage, depending on where you are, buy a mortgage of over $580,000, $820,000, depends on a little bit on where you are, but all right, not the home price, just the mortgage. So that's all they can do. Why did they buy mortgages? Not because they could buy anything and they pick mortgages. They are legally constrained to only buy two things, treasuries and mortgages. So they bought $1 trillion of mortgages. That was roughly 87% of new issuances of agency securities over this time frame where they're buying. They bought basically the whole market. So what happens if I buy a lot of mortgages? Well, remember that very first graph, demand for mortgages goes up. What is the value of a mortgage? Well, the value of a mortgage is an interesting question. The value of a mortgage is, well, how much did I get it for my house? Well, how much did you need for your house? What's the appraisal? What's the valuation? This gets back to this question. All of a sudden, all of our homes were worth a lot more money. Why? Well, there was a huge new demand. The thesis of this paper, there's a huge new demand for mortgages. And that demand for mortgages was the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing, which is when they buy assets. So this shows the entire mortgage market. And I go all the way back to 1995, not because I think the 90s were super cool, they were, and because I wanted to start with my high school graduation year, just had my 30th reunion. But I do this because I want to show how much the world has changed. Before 2008, in the great financial crisis, the Federal Reserve owned none. Mortgages were owned by banks, by investors, both at home and abroad. Starting in 2009, during the great financial crisis, the Fed did this quantitative easing, and they bought mortgages. We didn't see this phenomenon that I'm discussing in the first wave of mortgage purchasing in the light blue, that they then kind of kept steady, even after the crisis ended. Now, why are we only seeing this in the COVID crisis? I would argue something else happened in 2009 called the Great Housing Panic. The Great Financial Crisis, epicentered around housing. So when the Fed was buying mortgage-backed securities in 2009, there was a different thing going on in the housing market. COVID, the housing market wasn't really at play, and I'm going to turn to what happened with the housing market in COVID and some alternative explanations. But I want to point out the Federal Reserve owns a lot of our mortgages. And then again, it's a current amount and boom, it jumps up again. This is when they're buying essentially almost the entire market, near 90% of the market. Now they own $2.7 trillion of mortgage-backed securities and continually seem to say, well, this doesn't affect the price of a home. And that's the part I can't get beyond my Econ 101, that when you buy demand for mortgages and supply of mortgages is fixed, price of mortgage has to go up. Price of mortgage equals price of house. So let's take a different view and try and compare a mortgage-backed security to another security. I took AAA corporate debt as a spread. And what you'll find is the time period of quantitative easing, there's a huge decrease in the spread between the interest rate of mortgages and the interest rate of high-quality corporate debt. Other central banks around the world, when they did quantitative easing, bought high-quality corporate debt. Why? Because they're legally allowed. But in the United States, the Federal Reserve is not legally allowed to do that under normal operating monetary policy, Section 14. They can do extenuating circumstances. Hold that aside. So they narrowed the spread. This had a major impact. And then when quantitative easing ended, the spread moved up. Right? Supply, demand, natural situation. To me, this shows they had a big impact. Now, here I want to give you a different way to look at things. This is the average annual change in home value and percent interest rate. And what I'm showing here is most people think when the Federal Reserve is impacting the price of homes, it's an interest rate story. Oh, the Fed's raising rates, the Fed's lowering rates, this changes the value of your house. And what I'm trying to do is say, that's there's a value there. But what's unique in this COVID housing inflation surge, where did that $72,000 of median home price appreciation come from, is not an interest rate story. It is a quantitative easing story. So I have 3 time periods here. The first time period is the pre-COVID, 2012 to 2020. I think we see a pattern, right? Now, quantitative easing happens. Mortgage rates fall to 3%. Home values skyrocket. But they skyrocket a lot more than you think they would just because of 3%. Something else is happening here. Why are all the dots way above the line? And then March 2022, the Federal Reserve stops buying mortgages, starts raising interest rates. So now you begin to see the interest rates move very quickly and the market moves fast, and home prices kind of go around what you'd expect. There's a lot more divergence. There's a choppy period. But if you have a line of best fit in an item, they're not kind of all clustered above the line the way that you saw during quantitative easing. This is why the interest rate story is important, but is a much smaller part of the story than is appreciated. And most of the conversation has to do with the interest rate channel as opposed to the quantitative easing channel. Okay, so I want to talk about a couple different alternatives. Hopefully I've convinced you all that quantitative easing, buying mortgages, increase the value of housing, creating the housing inflation that then the Federal Reserve said we needed to raise rates to stop to lower inflation, right? And so the people seem to say, okay, well, the interest rate action explains the price of housing. Really? If interest rates were the dominant driver in housing, well, this cut that we saw here is when housing prices skyrocket. Well, they must have come pummeling back to earth with this giant increase that dwarfs a cut. No, the chart showed they went up and stayed constant, just like the Fed's mortgage-backed security holdings. Go up, stay constant. If this was an interest rate story, where's the up, where's the down from the rise of interest rates? The second alternative explanation I hear frequently is COVID changed where people want to live and housing had to readjust. And I think we have had different experiences of the same thing. I almost bought a second home in a beautiful little resort area in Western Maryland right before COVID. I couldn't agree on a price. It didn't happen. Now I look at that same property and it's skyrocketed in value. And I'm like, oh, I would have made a lot of money. But okay, if people change where they want to live, they did. You'll see the outlying suburbs had a little bit of an increase in where people want to live, and downtowns fell a little bit. There's no denying that. But 2 things. 1, the change in preference ain't that great. I mean, it happened, but it's small. How many people do you know who left and permanently went somewhere different? I know a couple, but it's not enough to change. Number 2, this is a zero-sum game. If you want to move to the outlying burbs and press that, you'd see prices in downtown fall. Anybody see that? No, what you see in the national story is this giant increase and stay constant. So the alternative about how COVID created this structural change, to me, should wash out. 1, it's not that great. 2, it should wash out in the end, neither of which we see in the house price data. Okay, alternative 3. Well, this is a supply story. This is a story that you like to see a lot. If you follow YIMBY Twitter like I do, everybody knows a yes in my backyard as opposed to a no. And I was really eager to share this because Las Vegas is an outlier. No city in America did more to build more housing units from 1990 to 2013 than Las Vegas. And guess what? It worked, right? It did more. You may think house prices here are so expensive. We just heard the skyrocketing legislative districts. But I can tell you, had you not done all this, you would have been up where San Francisco, Honolulu, and other places are. But look at the axis. Look at the x-axis. These are annual housing over a 23-year build period. Supply matters, but supply is a long-run story. What you saw in home price appreciation was a short-run story, a massive spike up and then a flat line. So yes, supply matters, but it can't be the driver here in this story because the time horizons of the two don't match up. And by the way, you guys are doing a great job here. Keep up building. There's some data showing that post-2013, these trends may not have held as much, and that's going to come home to roost in the next buildup. And if you guys ever go to Raleigh, you may also see a lot of new looking homes. Who knew that there was a lot in common here? Phoenix probably doesn't surprise you. Okay. Now, what happened in housing starts? They increased during quantitative easing, which makes sense because interest rates were so low. Housing supply is interest rate sensitive. So again, if this is a supply story, the quantitative easing starts should have, over the forward-looking market, decreased home values because you saw an increase in home price. But again, we haven't seen that. So if I've now taken down three alternatives that you've heard, let me say maybe the story is even worse than we've been led to believe. Maybe housing inflation, as officially measured, doesn't capture everything that some people are talking about and complaining and why this has become a hot button, front of center political debate. And so here is a graph. We talk about housing, and I've talked about housing so far in one giant thing, housing. But really, housing is a complicated set. So this paper looked at what they called starter homes and trade-up homes. And it tried to talk about what we call the lock-in effect. Anybody agree? Who here has a mortgage under 4%? Okay. You're locked in. This lock-in effect is talking to you and to you, because if you want to move, the new mortgage you're going to get is over 6%. Housing rates have fallen, actually. For a while, it was at 7%. So the argument about lock-in is we can't move. So that if that is true, you should see a difference between the starter homes that people buy at the beginning and then the move-up homes, the condo to the single-family unit story. And in point of fact, you do see the S is starter homes, and it's broken between kind of cheaper and more expensive, and the T are trade-up, that is the home you buy after the starter. And you do see this huge kind of increase in home ownership, and you do see a bit of interest rate lock-in in both groups, but more so in the starter group, indicating that perhaps part of the problem stems from the starter group not moving up, which then reduces the supply of available starter homes because of the locked-in effect. And there's some area there. But why are interest rates high after QE? Interest rates were high for a long time because the Federal raised reserve to fight inflation, and that inflation was caused by housing. So there's a circularity that they're fighting the inflation caused by housing that I am arguing, and Alan and I are arguing, was driven by buying a bunch of mortgages under the guise of their own policy. So the policy ramification from this paper is when the Federal Reserve considers quantitative easing in the future, it needs to consider mortgages not as a abstract financial asset that have no consequence on home price, which is what a lot of the academic literature does. It treats it just like any other debt instrument, like corporate bonds or other things, not because they're intellectually the same, they are not, but because the law constrains the Fed to from buying other assets here. So I mentioned that inflation could be worse. This is a view of rent as calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the official measures. And again, I want to be very clear, the official measures are real, they're honest, they're non-political, they're nonpartisan. Anybody who attacks them is crazy in terms of their honesty and integrity. That doesn't mean that they're always right. They're trying to capture something based on their statistical methodology that they're capturing honestly and with integrity, but statistical methodologies change over time. And so new data comes available. So Zillow has a metric, and their metric really tracks BLS pretty closely up until the pandemic. And then something different seems to happen. Zillow captures something moving a lot faster, and the two haven't reconvened, although you'll note that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has started to become closer to Zillow than vice versa. Zillow didn't go down. The other one has to do with what the median mortgage is. The median mortgage moves with the median home price. Mortgages shot up a lot more than rents. And this has to do with the driver of housing being owner-occupied. One argument here is, okay, well, how owner-occupied behave very differently than rental. Well, what's the big difference? Well, generally, rental isn't being bought as much by the Federal Reserve in mortgage-backed securities as owner-occupied. To me, the driver that mortgages are jumping more than rents reinforces the argument that housing inflation is inherently tied with this $1 trillion of mortgages the Federal Reserve bought. Now, you can say, okay, Aaron, inflation was global. You've been just talking about America, and I said, okay, well, we had to ease into a macro. The last presentation was so micro, we had to ease into a macro. We just looked at close America. Housing is actually the closest you can get to a closed economy. It's really hard to buy a house in another country and have that be a substitutable good. So I pulled up on this chart, this is England. This is England's housing inflation, and what you'll find there is their 12-month rate of housing inflation is 2%. Not that different, they're 3%. It's actually lower. Bank of England didn't go and buy a bunch of mortgages. Their housing inflation is lower than average. Our central bank went and bought $1 trillion of mortgages. Our housing inflation is higher than average. To the right is the European Union, famously different than England. England walked away from that. And again, now in the European Union, there was an increase in home prices, but it's kind of come a lot closer back to trend. Much closer than it has. You can see now the difference is much smaller, whereas we're still $72,000 above. And so on a global basis, I argue what happened in America was unique and different. It was a different inflation story than the rest of the world, and that different inflation story in the rest of the world was driven by the fact that our central bank behaved differently than the rest of the world. Good. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Aaron. So we've had a micro view of Clark County in Nevada. We've now had the global, and now we're going to return to the implication of this. That is the houses that do not get created. So I'm excited to welcome back to Brookings Mountain West, Chris Nelson. We've had the opportunity in the last couple of years to work with Chris on a couple of economic development reports. Of course, he's a long-time collaborator with my predecessor, Rob Lang.
Yeah, thank you all very much. I'm looking at a forward-looking view. So we have the current, we have the past, explaining the current situation around the country, partly and also in Nevada. I'm going to take a look forward to the year 2040, 2050, and compare future demand to current supply and trends and so forth. And I'm calling this Nevada's predictable train wreck. I'm going to show you the train wreck that is going to happen unless we do something about it beginning now. My presentation is based largely on demographic analysis. Now, my training actually is as a regional economist, and I backed into demography when I couldn't explain things that were happening in the world, in my planning world. And then I realized, okay, I need to understand something about people for a change. People age, they move along, they have cycles, and so on and so forth. So then it occurred to me, gosh, who here in this room can predict the inflation rate or the GDP in the US 10 years from now? Aaron might, but I can't. Anybody else? But who here knows how old they will be in 10 years? Of course. But it's more than that. In 10 years or 15 years, or pick the number, your life cycle will have changed. You're upsizing, downsizing, adding children, becoming empty nesters. And so then you begin to see the housing demand unfold as the population changes in age and composition over time. So I'm going to be using data in a way that most planners, actually, as far as I can tell, no planners, use to project housing demand to the future for Nevada, and particularly Southern Nevada. So I'm going to talk about my presentation is on the big picture, looking ahead. I'm going to be asking a question in terms of a local site plan, 30,000 acres of land south of town here. What were we thinking? I'm going to say that although projecting the future is folly, we still need to do it because we need to organize our resources to anticipate future demand. I'm going to note that we're behind the demand curve already, and it's going to get a lot worse, and I'll show you why that is. We need to get over the baby boom already. I'll talk about that for a little bit. And then we need to rely on things like infill and redevelopment to a much greater extent than we have in the past. And I'll show you some numbers on how that is possible. I'll show you some numbers in terms of what could be done if we are more assertive in infill and redevelopment in Southern Nevada. I'll touch on a series of local tools that could be used to facilitate some of that process, adding new homes, adding supply. But I'm going to suggest that we probably need the legislature in this state to tell local governments what they have to do to give the local decision makers political cover. And I'll end with that. So the big picture is that there's not enough housing for many market segments. We kind of all know that intuitively. Housing production is lagging demand. Suppressed production increases housing costs. We all know these things. People are shacking up more than they have in the past because of lack of supply or lack of affordability. Some people are becoming homeless for lack of supply. That's a fairly recent phenomenon in the U.S. So I want to ask the question: does anybody disagree with these big picture things? I think even Aaron would agree with this, particularly Aaron. I want to touch briefly on a redevelopment site called Ivanpah. I forget, what's the proper name? Ivanpah. This is 30,000 acres, a master planned area. I think it's a combination of some federal land and local land and so on and so forth. It's a scenario for what could be done with this site in terms of meeting future needs. It's 30,000 acres of land. It's not small. It's supposed to be walkable and multimodal, but it's 4 units to the acre. It is so 1970s, business as usual master planning that it's way out of time, way out of touch with realities. And I'll come back to this a little later on in terms of what has to be done. So I would call this the one scenario. Certainly it is a scenario. And I'll touch on what has to be done to sites like this and others around the metropolitan area to catch up to the times. So, a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, teaches at Harvard. He says projecting the future is folly, but we still have to do it. When we size our water and sewer plants, they are 20, 30, 40, 50-year investments. And we have to have some idea of what we're building these things for and where the water and sewer demand would be and so on and so forth. So even though projecting the future is folly, we still need to get some sense of where we're headed in the future. Now, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be looking at, I'm going to construct a future based on my sense of the demand for housing using what's called the headship rate. So the headship rate is nothing more than the number of householders in an age group divided by the number of people in that same age group. And here you see an example. It's a fictitious example, but in this case, 100,000 householders between 15 and 34, 400,000 persons of that same age group. It's a household, it's a headship rate of 0.25. I'm going to calculate this headships rate for, let's see if I have, 3 age groups, 15 to 34, which I call the starter home household group. These are people just starting out, they're renting their small homes and so on and so forth. Those between 35 and 64, these are the peak housing demand householders, having families, have income they want to use to consume more housing. They want larger lots and larger homes and the rest of it. And then 65 and older are people who are downsizing. They're empty nesters. They don't want to take care of the yard or the house anymore, so they're moving down in the housing stock. I'm also looking at white and non-white. So I've got 6 dimensions here, 3 age groups and 2 race ethnicity groups. I'm using the year 2000 headship rates to project future demand to 2050. But the headship rate changes all the time. The headship rate this year is different than last year and so on and so forth. I use the year 2000 for some interesting reasons. First of all, the 2000 census is the least complicated by recessions or viruses or bugs or housing bubbles or all these things. It's the most stable census year we can find in recent history that has also the data detail we need to do the analysis. And number 2, although we would think that things like home ownership rates or education levels would have improved between the races from 2000 to now, almost 25 years later, and wouldn't that change the headship rate dynamics? No. We still have the same home ownership gaps between white and non-white, and now as in 2000. We still have the same education gaps now as we had in 2000. And so, to some extent, the year 2000 headship rates gives me, people like me, a sense of where the market should be. And then finally, the big assumption is, if you lived in your own household in the year 2000, you did so out of choice, more so than perhaps now. We see that over the recent years, we've seen an increase in what's called the multi-generational household. And that what that means is that people, not by choice, but by lack of supply, lack of price, lack of availability, and so on and so forth, they are staying with the parents or the grandparents and moving in and so on and so forth, or they don't want to. Now, some certainly do, but they don't want to. So the year 2000 headship rates, to me, is a benchmark for a proxy for what would the market look like today based on a point in time 2000 that I think is a stable point in time reflecting a natural distribution of housing demand by age group and white, non-white. So using the headship rate analysis going to 2040, here is the state demand by county in the year 2040. So 1.5, 1.6 million household demand in the year 2040 based on my analysis. Look at Clark County, 1.2 million household demand based on these headship analysis. You're the first people to see this, by the way. The census defines a household as everybody living in the same housing unit. So you could have mother, father, grandparents, kids coming back from college, all staying in the same housing unit, or you could have 6 buddies renting various rooms in the same housing unit, and that's called one household. Even though you have different subgroups of people who consider themselves their own people, their own household, the census calls them one household. And so a household is nothing more than an occupied housing unit. So the difference between those who want a home of their own based on my headship rate analysis and the number of occupied housing units, that difference is what I call missing households. So I use Clark County. You can walk through the steps here. This is in my paper. You can, go home and do your Excel files to see how this all works. But the bottom line here in the far left-hand corner, you're right, I guess, is that Clark County in 2022 was missing 46,000 households. These are people who want a home of their own but can't or don't. So we're already behind meeting housing demand based on this metric by 46,000 households. Now, I tell my students, never create a complex chart. That, leave it to me to do that, right? So here's the projection of housing demand for the state and all the counties to the year 2040 compared to the supply in 2022, and then adjusting for picking up, adding new housing to meet the needs of the missing households. So we see in the new occupied housing unit demand figure 466,000. So we need in this state to build 466,000 new occupied housing units. Now, in addition, we need to add to that demand vacant units, seasonal homes, and so on and so forth. So these are just occupied housing units. We need to build about 466,000 occupied housing units to the year 2040 to meet the entire state's need for housing units. And by county, you can see how this works out too, especially Clark County, 380,000. And then you move to the far right-hand column and you see what does that mean in terms of annual average production. It's about 23,000 homes statewide average annual production. Okay, that's a target. We need to go there. What have we been doing though between say 2013 and 2023? We've been averaging only 16,000 units a year. And as Aaron was pointing out, these were the boom years. We were the national leader in housing production. Those are the good years. We're not even going to come close to that if we project the future as the past. We're already behind the 8 ball. We're already behind the demand curve, and it's probably going to get a lot worse. That's the train wreck. Something else is going on too. We're probably not building housing to meet future demand. A lot of public officials and planners and so on and so forth think of the future as their own past experience. Well, a lot of us, maybe not so much this crowd anymore, but I know so many public officials around the country whose vision of the future was their vision of their past. Fast forwarding their single-family detached home, and everybody wants that no matter how old they are. So look at the change in household characteristics between 1980 and 2010, which, by the way, was the nation's absolute peak period of demand for suburban-type homes, detached homes, large lots, and so on and so forth. And going forward, 2010 to 2040, as the boomers get older and pass away and so on and so forth, and as the market then basically shifts from a youthful, family-oriented market to a downsizing, older, even more stable market in the future. So Clark County, the demand for peak housing, those between 35 and 64, between 1980 and 2010, they accounted for 61% of the entire change in housing demand, 61%. Going forward, 2010-2040, that peak housing demand group will only account for a third of the new housing demand. So if we're stuck building zoning land and anticipating homes to meet the peak housing demand market, that's gone. That ended in 2010. We need to shift gears in our planning and our housing and everything else to meet the emerging demand. And Washoe County, Reno, same phenomenon. The balance of Nevada is even worse, where for the rest of the state, 61% of the peak housing demand during the 80 to 2010 period was for the peak housing household. That plummets to 14%, and look what happens to the rest of the state in terms of the downsizing householder demand, 65 and older. It goes from a third roughly to almost 90%. Are we prepared for these changes? No. But if we know the numbers, and you have the numbers now, if you know the numbers, you can begin to do some things to maybe shift the patterns and anticipate better what the future needs are. And then shifting gears a little bit, what is it that people prefer as a community to live in? So every 2 to 3 years, the National Association of Realtors does what it calls the Community Preference Survey. I love their survey because it's called a Stated Preference Survey or Forced Choice Survey. That is to say that given two choices, two equally plausible choices, what would you choose? Now, to back up a little bit, the NAR survey usually starts with a basic question, right now, today, what kind of a home would you prefer to live in? Choices are single-family detached and condo, apartment, single wide next to a toxic waste dump. No, not that one. Just keep making sure you're awake. So, of course, 70%-ish of all the respondents say, yeah, I want that detached home. I don't want to do the attached option. But then the survey says, oh, what if we told you that if you wanted to live in a walkable community, and that required only that you live in attached homes, condo, townhouse, apartment, whatever it is. So if you wanted to live in a walkable community, you have to live in an attached product, or you can live in a detached home that's only drivable. So pretty stark choices. It turns out that a little more than half of the respondents always, in all the surveys since 2010, 2012, whatever they started this, all the surveys, about half of American respondents would say they would prefer to live in a walkable community, even if that meant living in an attached product. Of course, the other half says, I don't want to live in a walkable community. I don't mind living in a detached home. Okay, I get that. Half and half. The problem is that right now, even among the half that want to live in a walkable community, even if it's attached homes, only 13% of American households already live in a walkable community. So in other words, even if we built all new homes in the US between now and 2050, if all new homes were built in attached products in walkable communities, we still wouldn't meet demand in 2050. And so what is a walkable community, and why does this attached thing come into play? So Opticos Architects has invented the idea, Dan Parolic, the architect, he's invented the idea called missing middle housing. And basically it's what we used to have in terms of duplexes, threeplexes, fourplexes, under 3-floor structures. If we had single family, they were clustered single family, oftentimes with an informal ADU, accessory dwelling unit, in them, a hidden illegal rental unit inside the structure, which used to be legal in the olden days. Now they're not. So if you look at the overall density needed to achieve a missing middle housing neighborhood, it's about 20 to 40 units per acre, overall average. And this is actually a walkable community. If you look at the footnote at the bottom, Lawrence D. Frank I mentored him at Georgia Tech, and now he's the most famous planner there is. I'd like to say he owes my career he owes me his career, but I won't go that far. Brilliant fellow. What they did is they figured out, okay, what is the density of a walkable community? Until their paper, nobody really knew. And here's the citation. Look it up, use it. So it turns out that if you have a community of 10 homes per acre as a gross density, that means the total area, which means the net density is more like 13, 14 units to the acre, the built density. At 10 to the acre gross density, half of the people are going to walk someplace, to some destination. If you go to 20 units to the acre, gross acre, that's more like 25 to 30 net acre development, 70% of the occupants will be able to walk someplace. If you get to 33 units to the acre, it goes up to 80%. So 20 to the acre, gross acre, is kind of what I think is the sweet spot for large area planning to achieve walkability. But that means the missing middle household density. And one other characteristic of the missing middle housing template is that these structures are not high structures. These are capped at 3 floors. Why 3 floors? Because in most states, including Nevada, if you go to a 4th floor, you have to install an elevator, which isn't cheap, and then maintaining it. So if you cap the levels at 3 levels, and one more thing, at 3 levels, you can do wood frame construction. If you go to 4, you're probably looking at steel reinforced concrete. Very different price point. So the sweet spot for pricing, construction, density for achieving walkability is this missing middle household configuration. Now let's go back to the Ivanpah scenario. Here's a plan, 25 to 45, 16,000 acres, a total of about 27,000, it's total 30,000 acres, but this is just the residential piece of the 30,000 acres. Most of the land is going to be open spaces or commercial, industrial park, and so on and so forth. You can see the configurations on the right-hand side. But among the residential types, 16,000 acres are projected, 16,000 units are projected at 3 to the acre, less than 3,000 units are projected at 7 to the acre, and they call that missing middle density. You see the disconnect there? That's nowhere near what missing middle density actually is. And then multifamily at 20 to the acre. So the overall average for this Ivanpah scenario is 4 units to the acre. It is not walkable. It is not multimodal. It is not solving the regional housing problems. It is so backward looking, it's a textbook, but it's not the future. So an alternative would be something like, let's average 20 to the acre, not 4 to the acre. Let's average 20 to the acre because that is walkable, that is multimodal, and it gets us 123,000 housing units. And so here we have 26,000 housing units, 27,000 versus 123,000 to 100,000 more, basically. If we're trying to meet future housing needs in Clark County, and we know the market is changing, it's predictable, and we know people want to have walkability. Not everybody, but half of the population wants walkable neighborhoods. This is where we need to go for all future development. But we're not doing that with the Ivanpah scenario, but maybe we can change the scenario. Just change the scenario. Make it walkable. Increase the density. And oh, by the way, by doing so, we add supply of housing to meet future needs where the current scenario, this scenario, is nothing. It's maybe 2 years of housing production for the whole county. This is many years. This is maybe up to 10 years of housing production for the whole county. Oh, but wait, there's more. So many years ago, actually for Brookings, I created this concept of predicting what point in time in the future certain land uses can be changed from the current use to a future use. So this particular chart shows the average useful life for different classes of property with residential homes on your far right. So it turns out that on an average basis, a typical residential unit will last 160 years. Now, not that they would stand up for 160 years, it's that the occupants, the owners and occupants of the residential units will make the investments along the way to keep that structure going. It's an investment in a lifestyle and your life. But the other land uses, warehousing, offices, retail, these are built for, these are commodities built for a return on investment by investors. So their average is like 20 years, 50 years, 60 years, whatever it is. The overall average is something like 40 years. Now, right now, today in Southern Nevada, roughly 80% of all of the non-residential properties are low-rise, one level, maybe two levels, at a 0.2 FAR, floor area ratio. Floor area ratio is the ratio of built space to land area, 0.2, 20%, which means that on average in Southern Nevada, 80% of all of the low-rise structures are sitting on asphalt. I mean, mostly asphalt. And by 2040, more than about 3/4 of all of the low-rise structures in Clark County by 2040 will have gone way beyond their useful life and should be repurposed into what? You know, that's up to us, but as planners and so forth. But that's an opportunity. Now, let me show you, how this works. Let's say that tomorrow morning a building opens across the street, has a 50-year useful life, and we start at the upper left-hand chart there. And a 50-year useful life property loses value 2% per year for 50 years, and at the end, it's all washed up. It sits on land, though, and land value, especially in Clark County, increases every year. Maybe it's 2% per year compounded, just to be on the conservative side. So at about the year 28, the land is worth more than the building. The investor says, holy smokes, I've got to unlock the value of the land. And they begin to make that calculation some years before and certainly some years after. So at some point in time, that building is going to be removed, replaced, repurposed, whatever it's going to be. And so if we know these fundamental characteristics, we can use assessor records, and this is out of Salt Lake County, Utah, where I did this some years ago. We could map every non-residential parcel in our area and predict within 5 years or so which of these will become ripe for redevelopment within 5-10 year periods. And so and we color coded this, so the darker the color, the hotter the color, the more immediate that land can be redeveloped. The darker shade is like right now, the lighter shade is within 15 years, give or take. Gosh, if we knew this as planners and public officials, we could say along corridors, oh, by the way, this corridor is going to be toast in 10 years. What can we do now to anticipate conversion of this declining commercial area into something that is more vibrant and higher and better use and so forth? What if we engage the neighbors around this in the green and the landowners and the tenants of the retail and office properties, get them down into a group and say, oh, by the way, in 10 years, boys and girls, this corridor is toast. What can we do now to make it easier to redevelop this area into something we all, including the residences, would like to have? And oh, by the way, the residences would be induced to support this conversion planning because it's a way to protect themselves from incursions of non-residential uses in their neighborhoods. So you have a quid pro quo. Neighbors, you give us the flexibility to upgrade and redevelop and take the pressure off you, or business as usual, you could be facing conversion that you don't want in the future. It's called planning. So that's the promise for this kind of analysis. Now, we did this for the Maryland Parkway, the light rail plan, and now it's a BRT plan, or I'm not sure what it is these days. So we took the Maryland corridor from the airport up to the medical school, and we inventoried all the parcels, all the land, found the parcels that were already vacant or underused, and those parcels that within 20 years or so would convert from what they are now to something that should be converted. So we have about 2,000 acres of land by the year 20, I forget the year, 20 years later, 2050. 2,000 acres of land along the corridor would become ripe for redevelopment. Redevelopment to what? This is a highly urbanized area. I used a 2.0 floor area ratio factor. That gives us 200 million square feet of total space, residential, office, retail, university, institutional, medical, whatever it is. That's a $50 billion potential investment you can unlock if you do advanced planning right now and tell all the property owners, here's what we want you to anticipate, and we'll create the planning, the zoning, and everything else to support your conversion to something that's future-oriented, not past-oriented. So we need to take a fresh look at what we have. We need to have places like the Ivanpah project. We need to say, okay, that plan, that scenario, so 70s. What should that be in the year 2050, 2040, or something future-looking? We need to look at the capacity of urban infill and redevelopment towards the future opportunities. And we needed to identify the opportunities for leveraging public resources to facilitate conversions that allow us to continue our growth in this region. I'm just about out of time, it looks like, but what are some of the local housing tools we can use? Accessory dwelling units, for example, increases supply of housing on a house-by-house basis. We all know sort of how that works. Allowing conversion of existing single-family homes to plexes, or maybe some by-right middle housing opportunities around the area, rethinking our parking needs. Are these things going to happen locally? I don't think so. Does any local government, and I'm asking, because I don't know, does any local government in Southern Nevada allow by right accessory dwelling units? So who? I believe the county does. Oh, the county does. Well, that's a step in the right direction. Thank you. I didn't know that. That's a good thing. This is what Portland, Oregon does. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. So here's something that we might need the legislature, behind the scenes, some local government officials in many states, Utah, Arizona, California, they might have a public face, but behind the scenes they tell their legislators, if we want to increase the supply of housing, we need to do such things as enable statewide ADUs by right, or lot splits by right, as they do in California. We need to right-size development fees so that we're not overcharging for the home. We need to make, in Utah preempts homeowner associations and CC&Rs from prohibiting accessory dwelling units in existing homes. So we need to rethink some of these barriers to housing production by quietly going to legislators and say, wouldn't it be a good idea if you told us what to do? And we'll never tell you that we don't like it, but give us the political cover to do the right thing. And okay, I've basically gone over all of these things already, but this is a train wreck that is predictable, but also solvable by anticipating the needs now. Thank you all very much.
All right, we're going to transition here just for a moment, get set up for our two panels. First one will be moderated by Aaron Klein, taking a look at housing finance, and I'll let you introduce your panelists.
This is an all-star panel, and welcome me in introducing to my immediate left, Susan Wachter, the Sussman Professor of Real Estate and Finance at the University of Pennsylvania. David Sanchez, who's the Acting Chief of Staff to the Federal Housing Administration at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and Elizabeth Carroll, Executive Director at J.P. Morgan Chase Home Lending. So we have an academic expert who's frequently cited and quoted in publications ranging from the mainstream to academia, listened to by policymakers. We have policymakers coming out here from Washington to address the real problems that we have. And we have a private sector. The person who's actually making the loans in this. So we have different perspectives. And maybe we should each start by talking a little bit about how your role and work intersects with the theme of improving our housing finance system. David, maybe we can start from you and work our way out.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, it's great to be here, and thanks everyone for coming to hear a panel where we're going to talk about housing finance. I'm David Sanchez, and I'm the acting chief of staff at the Federal Housing Administration and the Office of Housing, which is part of HUD. There are a couple different things. You know, HUD is a complicated place that does a lot of different things in the housing market. What I work on is the FHA mortgage insurance programs. So, you know, if a lot of people have heard the term FHA loan, you know, primarily what that means is we offer an option where a home buyer or someone refinancing only needs to put down 3.5% in order to make the home purchase possible. So in large part, we also have more flexible credit parameters than much of the rest of the market. So in large part, we are a source of mortgage credit for first-time home buyers, for people of color. You know, when you buy your first home, there's a pretty good chance you're using an FHA loan. If you buy your second or third home, there's a pretty good chance you're using a different part of the housing finance system, either the GSEs or a more private part. My office also oversees a pretty wide array of interesting programs. We oversee HUD's housing counseling program, HUD's manufactured housing safety standards, as well as a whole lot of project-based rental assistance across the country. So, you know, I'm here because I believe that all of these things matter. They matter a lot in Nevada. You know, the policies and the decisions we make as we implement these programs, you know, can make a big difference for, you know, not only who can access home ownership, but also will there be a home there to buy? And so I think, you know, supply is high on everyone's mind. It's very high on our minds at HUD. I'm happy to talk about that more later, but let me stop now.
Elizabeth Carroll. I've been with JP Morgan Chase 15 years and in our agency relations group for about half that time. And essentially, it's great that David went first. So we work with investors, insurers, guarantors, you know, to try to shape sustainable, efficient housing policy, innovations in the market. So very privileged to be able to work with a lot of super smart folks to try to tackle this problem, because it's not a one size fits all, and everybody has to do their part.
So I'm Susan Wachter. I'm a professor at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, head up an institute, which I founded, Penn Institute for Urban Research, when I left HUD, working with FHA and also with heading up the housing policy office at HUD overall. Since then, working with the private sector and with HUD and other officials, FHFA, on sustainability of the housing finance system. And I would say the housing finance system since the great financial crash, which I have a book about that and have advised about that. And I would say actually housing finance is pretty stable. We came through COVID with certainly problems on the demand supply balance, and we can talk more of Aaron's very interesting talk, but it didn't collapse as it did during the great financial crisis. However, my major focus has been on affordability, and since, you know, last 20 years since I was Assistant Secretary at HUD, I've been focusing, writing about affordability. It's only gotten worse. I don't know what that says about me and my work, but it's certainly important. I'm delighted to be here too in this great panel and at this great meeting on this issue.
Well, Susan, let's pick up on that theme. Where have you seen the affordability issues? I mean, interest rates are 6%. Prices went through the roof. We just saw a presentation about the high share of renters and homeowners who are paying a tremendous amount of money. The political candidates are talking about housing policy, housing inflation. Where do you see the market?
Well,
where it is now and where's it going?
To start with, officials are talking about housing, and well, they might. It is a major right now problem. We obviously have climate and other issues going forward, but right now, housing affordability is the problem, and it is, as Aaron pointed out, 90% of the inflation story has been housing, and it's not going to end. It's going to rebound, and again, it's part of the inflation story going forward, not just in the past, as well as for all of us, those of us who own prior to this incredible run-up, and this run-up has been unprecedented. 40% increase in housing prices since COVID, and inflation has gone up 20%. So housing prices have gone up double the rate of housing. If you own, you've benefited, but we need to, how do we house and put into the ladder of home ownership, which is the opportunity to build wealth, those who don't own? And that is the major, I think, challenge that we're all talking about. So one obvious component of that, of course, is the mortgage rate. And I do think, the evidence is that the mortgage rate is coming down. It's come down pretty spectacularly to 6% point something, 0.2 or whatever, from 8%, which is a pretty dramatic decline. And it's likely to decrease further as the Fed, the FOMC, is predicted to decrease the federal funds rate by about 100 basis points. So I would expect that by 2025, this is not breaking news, I said this last year, and you can look at my YouTube saying it last year, that we would be in the 5% range by 2025. I said, stay alive to 2025. That was not my phrase, that was Sam Zell, who started our Zell-Lurie Real Estate Center. You've got a real estate center, which I think is fabulous. I think bringing academics and policymakers together, which these centers do, is really what it's all about. Okay, so that is part of the story, but it isn't going to work unless we also have supply meeting the demand, which will be unleashed when interest rates drop. So that brings us to Chris's remarkable discussion about 5 minutes ago, whatever.
Well, so what are you guys doing? I mean, this is top of the mind. The administration, Susan and I are sitting here thinking we're coming up with great plans, great slides. You guys are making mortgages.
Yeah, absolutely, we are. So, I'd like to say, like we hear, exactly what Susan was saying, like we know these are the problems. Like we know that we have a housing supply shortage that is now engulfing, the vast majority of the country. I think Susan could probably say, told you so, but I think here we are and we have a problem and we have to address it. So our primary role in the market is, essentially it's a public-private partnership between lenders and the federal government to make mortgages. And we play a really, really important role in terms of allowing people with less money, with less well-developed credit to access home ownership. I continue to think that's really important. We've done a lot of things to try to broaden access to home ownership, access to, and previewing some of what we're going to talk about later, access to sustainable home ownership in particular. So, not only can you buy the home, but then can you stay in it? But it's pretty clear that, if this is the only tool that we have as the federal government to intervene in housing markets, like we cannot solve the supply problem by getting, by doing our historical role of getting more people into homes. We need to be doing more about that. So there's a bunch of work that's being done across the administration using existing tools to promote things like manufactured housing, promote things like accessible dwelling units, to also, continue to build more dense multifamily housing. We don't have all the levers at our control. In large part, HUD is an agency that can only do, to some extent, as much as Congress gives it resources to do, which is why I think it's really critical that housing is such a hot topic right now across the country, and that the vice president is talking about it on the campaign trail every day, because Congress has to come forward, and spend more money if we're going to solve this problem, at least from a federal level. I don't know if that answered your question.
I mean, if Congress isn't going to give money, JP Morgan Chase has money.
We have a few dollars. No, but we're part of the solution. I think we're all part of the solution trying to figure this out. At Chase, we're focused on making homeownership possible with the tools and the resources that are out there. And I think one of the things that we've found is a lot of people don't know what's out there. There's like a fact and a fiction about, I have to put 20% down, and you just heard 3.5. You can do 3% in some cases. There's so many things out there. We have programs at Chase. We start with before you're even ready to buy a home. Like, let's just start talking about credit. We have a credit journey module that takes you through and monitors your credit, gives you things like, how can I improve my credit? And then we have other tools, Chase My Home. You can look for a home. One of the things that I'm most proud of, we have a home buyer grant. So up to $10,000 for customers who are in certain census tracts, mainly majority minority census tracts. That's nationwide. It's in 15,000 census tracts. In Nevada, in Las Vegas, we've done $400,000 over the past couple of years to help customers get into a home, and they can use that for down payment. They could buy down their rate. So if they're concerned about a really high interest rate, they could use it there. But it's something that we've spent considerable funds on. We have a racial equity commitment at the firm-wide level. That's $30 billion with a B dollars. And so it's something that we're really focused on. But to David's point, Susan's point, like, we all have to kind of be here together doing it.
So Elizabeth, let's stay with that. I want to raise a topic David talked about, sustainable homeownership, right? 2008's financial crisis has left some serious scarring in this metro area, in Las Vegas, and many places around the country where there were unsustainable mortgages made. And we both have talked about credit. I want to be very clear. What you're talking about is credit score, an algorithm that assesses people's prospective credit that runs whether or not you qualify for an FHA mortgage, for other mortgages. Right? Whether or not that credit score is made to look like your SAT. It's made to look like your SAT. Why? Well, the dirty secret is they're not that accurate. It's my opinion, but people think SATs are accurate. SATs are very accurate in predicting where you're going to go to college because they're what colleges used for whether or not they admit you. Just like credit scores are very accurate for predicting whether or not you're going to have a mortgage because that's the formula they use. It doesn't necessarily mean whether you're going to pay the mortgage back or have a crisis. A lot of people walked out of that experience in the great financial crisis saying, maybe homeownership isn't a great idea for me. Maybe the cost, we saw owner costs. Well, do you think that's right? For who is homeownership a good deal and for who is it bad?
Yeah, no, this is a tough question, and I think it's super personal. So what my answer is going to be different than everybody else's. I think it depends on your financial situation. It's always unique. But I don't think people say, I'm going to buy my first home because I want to generate wealth. Maybe some people do, but I think it's like, I want a fenced-in yard for my dog. I want a nice school district. I want to live close to the grandkids. So I think that's more of what home ownership is to me. Having said that, home ownership is a great opportunity for generational wealth. That's a topic that was hit on earlier. There's a report from the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. Their 2023 Hispanic Housing report says that for Hispanic homeowners, they are like 26% higher, 26 times higher at generating wealth than Hispanic renters. So I think that's a great stat, but listen, it's a personal decision. So if someone wants to have the dream of home ownership, we're here to support them. If they want to open a business or they want to send their kids to college, like that may be their dream. And so I think that's something at Chase we're focused on, is whatever that dream is, we're here to help you achieve it.
Well, historically, sending your kids to college and opening up that small business has been from a mortgage. So that opportunity society that we've been has been very tied into home ownership historically. So having this generation also having access to wealth building, I think remains important. Overall, the median wealth of homeowners in this country is $400,000. The median wealth of renters is $10,000. But how do we get there? How do we get there, as you've asked, Aaron, in a sustainable way? because we surely don't want to repeat the extremely harmful great financial crisis where we had 7.5 million households lost their homes. And that in part was unsustainable mortgages, where we don't have to go through the whole story of how it happened, but part of it was putting people in homes which they could not afford. It wasn't sustainable. So that we absolutely must avoid. So how do we have sustainable home ownership? Well, we do have to get the interest rates down. That's happening, fortunately, with inflation coming down. We do need to increase supply so prices don't jump again with the increase in demand that's coming. But we also have to make sure that the home lending practices remain sustainable. And of course, we've got two folks here representing or with organizations which are part of that sustainability. So I personally, you're not either in the private or the public sector getting things done. Thank you for your hard work every day in making sure that we keep opportunity there, helping to keep opportunity, but making sure it's sustainable. So how do we do this? Well, it is personal. Many people will, live with their parents, let's say, or use the mom and pop bank to get savings, to build up through the credit ladder, which I think is terrific that you've got that for sustainable home ownership. And for many, the first home is the FHA insured loan to get on that ladder, but we're going to have to do more.
It's tough to follow Susan. Like Susan, I am a believer in the value of home ownership, and I don't think it's perfect for everyone, and I don't think that our government policy should be promoting it for everyone. But I happen to think that if you can demonstrate your ability to repay a mortgage, you should be able to buy a home in this country. So that's why I think the government programs that support this, as well as all the activities of the private sector that support it, are really incredible. We saw some really horrible things happen across the country, but especially here in Nevada in 2008. And I think there are a lot of things that we fixed at the federal level, including ensuring that mortgages are underwritten for an ability to repay, ensuring that if you have trouble paying your mortgage, you can have good options to kind of keep you on your feet so you can avoid foreclosure. I think those things are really, really important, and they can't solve every problem. If we have a massive housing bubble, unfortunately, the model we have is that homeowners are going to be exposed to the upside as well as the downside. But I do think, if not home ownership, it's kind of the best option we've got in the housing sector.
Yeah, I want to go back and ask the audience here a theoretical question. Would you rather earn 8% on your money straight up, or would you rather earn 2% on your money levered 20 to 1? Which is more profitable? Anybody want to guess? Right? What are they? And so that is something that when people, I think Elizabeth was talking about investing, and I was like, oh, having a home is where I live. Investing is what I do in my crypto account, right? That's a joke. Home ownership, the reason behind that huge disparity in wealth, Susan, that you point out, is that you can't leverage any other investment as an ordinary American the way you can at 3.5% down, which is even greater than 20 to 1. And you will find the math, even hold us that little steady 2% return, leveraged will outperform the 8% for quite a while. Not to mention you also get that fenced in yard. Let's flip from those people for whom they are in the home mortgage world to the renting. This year, it's estimated that 42% of Nevadan households rent. 58% of those renters are paying more than 30% of their income. So I'm trying to say about more than 1 in 5 folks here in Nevada are paying more than 30%, which is kind of what people assume is the max amount you should be paying. I like to think about it more mixed with transportation than just housing, but that's the thing. And that's from the Lead Center for Real Estate. So what can we do on this rental housing issue? We've talked about home ownership. We've talked about lowering interest rates to make it more affordable, lowering down payment amount, having down payment grants. What can we do for rentals?
Well, I think the actual rental story is in some ways a positive story because you showed it. Rents, or no, I'm sorry, our first presenters, thank you very much, it was fascinating. Rents actually haven't increased. And the reason they haven't increased, adjusted for inflation, is because supply has increased. However, I think once again, bringing it back, it's not just rental, it's rental where. And this is where your transportation point, Aaron, is so important. And communities that are not only rental affordable, but also connected to schools and jobs. So that's a planning we need to step back, and I think everyone in this room probably is part of that solution, but it's incredibly important. And by the way, rental affordability is absolutely key for owner-occupied affordability, because then you can save. If rent is taking 30% or less, you have some ability to save for your owner-occupied home.
Great. Well, yeah. So, I think it's pretty clear that we need more housing of many different types, serving people of many different incomes. There was a time when, our serious affordability problems for higher income households were limited to the coasts. That's not how things are happening. And people who make a very good living are paying a lot of money for rent, high shares of their incomes and are severely cost burdened. I guess I want to make a pitch here for some of what HUD does, because like I said, I think we need a lot more housing at a lot of different price points. Market rate housing, taking that huge tract of land south of Las Vegas and building, probably not heavily subsidized homes is something we need to do. But I would also, remind people that if you look at low-income Americans, there's no way that the math pencils out where you could build new housing without a subsidy that serves these people. And so I have to, at the same time that we're building tons more market rate housing, I also think we need to be investing in our public housing, our project-based rental assistance, our housing choice voucher programs. And I think we need to, I think if we're gonna chart a serious federal course forward in terms of solving the rental affordability problems, I think that has to be part of the program.
Let me follow up with that, David, because this is a fast-growing state. And I know in Washington, you have to think about all 50 states. But there's states that are shrinking in population, there's states that are growing in population, then there's Nevada, which are states that are exploding in population. And sometimes the formulas that are created have a difficulty dealing with fast growing. I remember when I was doing public transportation, we were giving up transit dollars based on your population from the prior decennial census. And it was shortchanging the state. And so we created one that started giving money based on census projection formulas. So you could build things like the Maryland Light Rail based on where people were going, not based on where people had been. And there's that issue as it relates to the formula for housing vouchers. There have been ways around that. You talked earlier about prefab houses or homemade, they're modular units, or something called Boxable, which is currently located in North Las Vegas, trying to create more affordable units for Nevadans. How should we think about increasing the production of alternative housing or prefab housing, manufactured housing, particularly in fast-growing communities?
Yeah. I think it's, all of the points that you raised there, I think are very good points. But I'll grab onto the example about Boxable, who's, I walked by one of the prototype homes on the way here today, so that was very cool. I'm a huge believer that, we have not seen significant gains in efficiency of home building the same way that we have across sectors all across the country. If you think about how we build a home, it's kind of like how we built a home in 1950. It's not all that different. You go to the site, it's a lot of waste. It's outside in the weather. I think that there are great efficiencies that can be gained by building houses different ways, including building them prefabricated in a factory. And if you look at, there was a study that came out of the Harvard Joint Center about this year. Some of the greatest savings come from manufactured housing. And so there's two different types of factory-built housing, kind of by and large. There's modular housing, which has to conform to the local building code. And then there's manufactured housing, which is also built in a factory, transported to the site, but it's built to a code that HUD regulates. And so the data showed that compared to building a home in place, there was a little bit of savings if you were going with a modular unit. It showed that there was actually really great savings by building to that kind of national building code that HUD has for the manufactured housing space. So I think it's an extremely important part of the solution. And I think we at HUD are spending a lot of time working on our policies, which takes a long time because we're the government, but we're rowing in the right direction to support manufactured housing, to support modular housing, to support ADUs. Yeah.
So if I have it built to the HUD code and I plop it down here and there's a difference with the local building code, how does that work?
It is a little bit, one of the barriers to manufactured housing is that, localities continue to have zoning that doesn't allow manufactured homes to go. So, HUD, specifically we regulate the safety and construction standards for the home. And so, to the extent that a local government is trying to block you over the safety of your manufactured home, they don't really have a case. There are all kinds of other discriminatory, I would argue, things that local communities can do to block manufactured housing, to block low-income housing. It's a hard problem to solve from the federal level, but that's also why we need to have these policy discussions here in Las Vegas and not just in Washington, D.C. Yeah.
It's incredibly important to get out of the Beltway bubble. And I commend you for coming out here to have this conversation. Elizabeth, you talked earlier about the credit stuff. And, there are a lot of federal programs and subsidies. FHA does this great thing for those who qualify. But, people who don't have these great credit scores, often through no fault of their own, don't have access to the bank of mom and dad. Friends and family are the number one source of down payment assistance. And that allows for people with intergenerational wealth to perpetuate intergenerational wealth. It can block the creation of that for folks who don't come from that. So what's your advice? What do you see from being out in the field as a lender for folks that are just on the edge of qualifying for a mortgage but aren't quite there yet?
Yeah, no, I love this question because I think there's so much focus in this space right now. I mentioned, credit journeys, so you start way early. And there's also a couple programs that we have. I went on Zillow and I looked at some houses in the local market, very nice. And then I went into our homebuyer assistance finder. And it's, you don't have to log in. We're not asking you to create a Chase account. And I typed in the property address. And it came back that this home was eligible for 3 programs. And I was like, if I was a first-time home buyer and I saw this, maybe I wouldn't feel so afraid to buy a home, or maybe I wouldn't feel like I wasn't ready. It was $80,000 that these homeowners could potentially qualify just for these 3 programs. Stack it with Chases, now you're talking about, I don't need mortgage insurance. But it goes back to that fact and fiction. Are you creditworthy? Are you not? I think we're redefining what creditworthy is. FHA has done a great job. Fannie and Freddie have both done great jobs of incorporating, you're paying your rent and you're paying it on time, and likely it looks a lot like what you want your mortgage payment to look like. We should factor that in when we're looking at providing a mortgage to you, and all 3 of those agencies allow that. And so I think we're moving in the right direction. I just think folks need to have some research, have some folks who can help them, guide them in the right direction.
So I can't end a conversation in September of 2024 and not talk about the presidential election, because it's happening. And this state will actually be one of the ones that really defines which direction we go. I'm from Maryland, and I think it's pretty clear which direction Maryland's going. But and housing affordability is going to be front and center on this, going into when people cast their ballot. What's going to be the outcome? How is this presidential election going to affect federal housing policy, Susan?
Oh, wow. Starting with me. Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm from Pennsylvania, so we're as divided and as critical for who's going to win. No matter who wins, we're going to need to have a transformative discussion about housing policy. housing supply, and also about the financial sustainability to make sure we don't put some kind of policy in place which leads to a incredible increase, which is not based on long-term fundamentals, and then a decrease and creates issues. So we have to be fearful of that. And I think among my group that I work with all the time, is not just academics, but practitioners, there's a group, we call ourselves housers, right? And it's pretty bipartisan, amazingly enough. And there's pretty much among us practitioners, whatever, okay, we need sustainable finance. We need a lot more attention on these programs that are actually out there and more understanding of them. And we need more housing supply. But one more thing I am going to add, which is, I think what has kept, since 2009, the housing finance stable in this country, so that when COVID hit, we didn't have a housing finance crisis at the same time, which could have happened. If we had had our housing finance crisis at the same time as we had a national health crisis, we would have a very different nation at this point. So we have to keep our housing finance stable. We have a new, reformed housing finance system that is stable. And it's not accidental, it's intentional. And the agencies are behind it. HUD, Ginnie Mae, Fannie and Freddie, who you work with, they're behind this. It's this intentional, stable housing finance, which doesn't include races to the bottom to qualify people who really cannot be in their home and will lose their home. No matter who is elected, there are always dangers to that. We need to have an understanding of what is a stable housing finance system and not threaten that. And going forward, there will be changes because the GSEs, Fannie and Freddie, are in conservatorship now going on since 2008, but they won't be going forward. At some point in the next 3 years, during whoever wins, they, I believe, are going to be on the road to privatization. So we need to do that in a way that's sustainable and stable. And I'm not going to go beyond that right now, and I'm not going to say one side or the other. We're just going to have to make it full on however this privatization occurs for the future of home ownership and the future of, I believe, America, make sure it's sustainable and stable.
Well, that's a massive prediction because, I mean, for a year ago, you were calling for 5% mortgages in 2025, and we're going to get there. So kudos to that. Now, this conservatorship, which is when the regulator, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, but the two of the largest companies in America, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who insure most people's homes, buy most people's mortgages, repackage them, sell them to the Federal Reserve.
And other investors. And other investors.
Well,
Nowadays,
he does have a point.
Now,
90% is going to.
and this is a huge deal. Have been in conservatorship ever since then. I helped write that law that enabled the conservatorship, and it was never anybody's intention to have this conservatorship anything more than temporary. And well, I think was it Ronald Reagan who said the closest thing to perpetuity in the world is a temporary government program? And here we are, over 15 years later, still in a temporary situation. And you're saying that in the next presidential administration, regardless of who wins, temporary is going to be over?
I believe so.
Well, that would be a huge fundamental consequence and puts a lot at stake on this ballot. Join me in thanking the panelists for this fantastic conversation. And the next panel.
All right, as we wait for our mics to get switched out, just want to remind everybody a couple things. Some of the items out on the table there, the first is an executive summary of Chris Nelson's paper, but at the bottom is the QR code. If you scan that, the paper can be downloaded. So it is up and ready for consumption there. We also had a couple of posters out there from some of our student researchers of the Brookings Mountain West and the Lindsay Institute. Those also have QR codes there. There's also another resource I do want to make available, known to everybody, and that is our data hub, which has got lots and lots of fact sheets, some data visualizations on housing there. So that's another resource for more information, more data. And of course, the excellent work that my colleague Shawn McCoy and his team does over the Lead Center for Real Estate there. And I want to thank them, of course, for their partnership on today's program. It's been great to work with them. So Shawn, as we wait for our other two panelists, what are your takeaways from the other two presentations?
My takeaway is the time to think about the missing middle. I think is now. My mic, thanks, Minja. Audio check. They're gonna have to catch it in the back. Our leading talk was really on the equilibrium on the price side, right? What's behind that trend? And what we show in a market with relatively stable rents in 2022, our big takeaway was they weren't really stable for homeowners in low-income areas. On the supply side, again, I thought that was just massively brilliant, segmenting the type, quality, and target market for housing to show that not only are things mismatched in today's market, but as we move forward in time, that composition of who needs what, when, where, and how is going to shift, right? But and thinking about, there we go. I can take a deep breath. Putting housing costs into perspective, one thing that we haven't really got to yet is how do we bring what's happening in the mortgage market together with what's happening on the price side? And housing costs can rise for a lot of reasons: changes in insurance costs, changes in utility bills, changes in mortgage interest. Housing costs can rise because they just cost more. We're seeing really two things happening right now that generally don't happen. That mortgage lock-in effect has helped prop housing demand, help prop housing prices up. So prices have been, on the owner-occupied side, pretty stable and resilient, but interest costs are still a lot. Nick, Irwin, and I brought these two statistics together to ask, well, how do we talk about housing in terms of conveying price levels in a way that clears both what's happening on the debt side with what's happening on the asset side? And the only way we could do it is we had to flip the question and say, well, we can't actually just give one nominal price. We did a thought experiment where for every point in time for the past 20 years, given the median income in a metropolitan area, we asked, how much house could a homeowner finance at prevailing home prices and prevailing interest rates? Let's express that in terms of square feet. And we did a comparison of 2016 to 2024. And then, and again, the key punchline was, how much less house could the median homeowner buy? 2,144 square feet since 2016. And we're averaging a loss of 140 square feet per year since 2012. As we're sitting here having this conversation, that's how much purchasing power is changing as we speak.
Wow. Stunning to think about. Yeah, you show those data. That's great. I want to welcome to our panel today, Dagny Stapleton, Community Housing Administrator for Clark County, and at the far end there we have Shanti Abedin, the Vice President of Housing and Community Development at National Fair Housing Alliance. Thank you all for participating, for coming out today. I want to start with a general question to our Nevadans, and I'll get to the national picture there. What are some of the largest barriers to housing access for those living in our metro?
So thank you. Hi, everyone. If you want to separate that into multifamily rental housing generally and single-family housing, what we see on the rental side, we focus on affordable housing, so really area median incomes below 80% and 60% for renters. We see that there is a huge gap, huge need for folks really at 60% and 50% AMI and below. We see that gap as high as over 80,000 units we need for folks below 50% AMI. That's the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I believe some of the lead data backs that up as well. And so we have a great need for affordable housing at that level. That kind of housing doesn't really happen without public subsidy, low-income housing tax credits, things like that. There's a great need for additional public subsidy for that. There's a great need for land. Construction costs are high, so those are some of the barriers. Basically, we need money, we need land. The county has put forward $170 million, actually historic amount of money supported by the County Commission to support, provide gap financing for multifamily affordable rental housing. And then on the single family side, we really see same thing, price, really at about 90 and 80% AMI and below, 100% AMI and below, that's where folks are priced out of the market. So that's, half of the folks in our metro area are priced out of the market for.
That was really good. Don't have much to add. At a meta level, when I hear the word access, I can't help but think about availability. What are we going to access? We need housing, right? And so, in terms of looking at that metro level landscape, it really matters, because if we are seeing frictions, for example, in the owner-occupied segment, we're going to see that spill over into the multifamily renter-occupied segment. In fact, the work Nick and I did when mortgage rate lock became in effect, really, the back end of 2023 going into the beginning of 2024, a lot of the findings that we showed you in today's report don't look like they do right now. The rent changes that we're seeing, even though they're modest rent increases, are hitting the valley more uniformly than they were in the past. And we believe that part of this is that it's just so difficult to find owner-occupied housing that would-be homeowners are becoming now renters.
Shanti, how much is this a Nevada, Las Vegas story, and how does this compare to what you're seeing nationally?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly clear that this is an issue that we're seeing across the board in different markets. It's, been an issue in coastal cities. It's definitely become an issue in mid-sized cities and cities across the country. And, I think we have talked a lot about kind of the two sides of this, right? We really need a suite of issues, no one size fits all kind of solution, but in every market that we have here, we need to be looking at the supply side. So what are we doing in terms of zoning, land use, increasing density, reducing the cost of building, embracing models like, modular manufactured housing, but also looking at things like how do we put aging housing stock back into use in some certain markets. So, it may be different than Nevada when you're looking at some of the supply side of things in different cities, but it's all kind of a relative spectrum of solutions that address the supply. And then, of course, on the housing finance side, the access to credit, that's just universally kind of an issue. And no matter what way we're looking at it, we really need to look at how each segment of the population in every metro area or every type of geography is having access.
Yeah, and I appreciate your point about the no one size fits all, because that certainly squares with your data. And in Chris's paper, he does a nice job giving a survey of what's going on around the West, and it's amazing how many different policies you have out there, some at the local level, a lot of them are at the state level now. Increasingly, you're sort of seeing this move up there. But I do want to go back to a point that you mentioned there, and this is the infill and the density issue there. So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I was back in DC, and all the members of the congressional delegation talked about housing at some point. They also talked about in terms of lands bills. Those two things were as if they were one and the same there. So all of our sort of elected officials seem to be talking about acquiring additional land here to address our housing deficit here. But as we all know, that's going to require a lot of infrastructure. Going to be transportation demands there, more roads, more schools, more services there, put workers farther away from their jobs, all those type of issues here. And obviously it's inconsistent with the data that Chris talked about, right? That people don't want that type of lifestyle anymore here. So why is Nevada generally been hesitant to look at zoning reforms and infill and some of these other policies to address our housing challenges?
Well, I have to represent Clark County here and just say that we actually, in our recent update to our development code, we included a density bonus for affordable housing as well as a parking reduction. So we are starting to do some of those things. We also have a development fee reduction for affordable housing. So that's exciting. We've had that in place for a couple of years. We also use county land as an incentive. So we surveyed the land we had available. So a lot of that is infill parcels. So we've got 3 parcels. Trying to total the acres in my head, but I can't do that on the spot here. But we've got 3 parcels in process now of being developed that are infill for county land. So different things that you can do. Those are some of the things that the county has done, and I think we're sort of being innovative in that respect.
And that's relatively new policy. I mean, for a long time, I lived here since 2000. Always just plow over more acreage in the desert and build more suburbs farther out. So it's good to see we're rethinking. I know Southern Nevada Strong's looking at infill as well as an option.
One thing we need to acknowledge is a couple things about infill development. A, we need it. We do. And for a lot of reasons beyond the obvious of just getting more housing, changing the quality of life and what it means to live in a city. I mean, cities have been the engines for growth in much of the U.S., and that can certainly be the case here. Thing is, what's left now, what's vacant left now, wasn't random. It wasn't by random chance that what's right. And talking to local developers, there are some non-trivial infrastructure costs to redeveloping some of these infill parcels. And there's a lingering issue behind all of this that is really making housing supply particularly difficult in Southern Nevada, and that's the cost of land. Right? Land prices have escalated here, and not to say that Nevada's alone, but they're in the higher end of that distribution. And when that happens, everything about housing policy changes. When we think about the arrival of new multifamily supply, it's going to be harder to pencil units that are targeting that missing middle. It's going to be harder to pencil properties that target those in one end. And so thinking about infill, we do need to think about that infrastructure piece. And on one margin, going out and acquiring new land does help with land price, but there's a whole secondary set of challenges that policymakers, voters, everyone alike need to think about, is that there will be infrastructure challenges, transportation challenges that happen that need to be thought very carefully about across that dimension as well.
And funded.
Correct.
Yeah. Shawn, what do you see nationally? Is anybody leading in this space in the communities you work with?
Yeah, I mean, I would just back up for a moment and just explain that. So the organization I work for is the National Fair Housing Alliance. We're a national civil rights organization dedicated to ending housing discrimination in all of its forms and also addressing the lingering impacts of housing discrimination across the country. So a big part of our perspective on the issue of land use and zoning is really thinking about equity and then thinking about communities and like equitable access to affordable housing, but also other types of amenities that occur based on kind of where you live and where you're able to live because of the housing or homeownership opportunities available to you. So just wanted to set that stage a little bit there. I mean, I think what we're seeing across the country is that a lot of cities, a lot of jurisdictions are looking at doing their rezoning plans. They're doing things like adding the ability for ADUs, granny flats, casitas, looking at that solution, looking at missing middle, whole states ending the practice of single-family zoning altogether. So seeing that in places like Oregon and Washington, cities like Minneapolis, addressing manufactured housing issues. But, I think the pushback is often universal. It's sort of this tendency for people to want to preserve the status quo of what has been. And even in areas where there's a lot of interest in redoing zoning that happened 60 years ago, that was put in place 60 years ago, there's still this momentum to sort of preserve the character conditions of a place. And that's always going to be a tension that we see in different places. And I would say also that, it's important that we remember that it's only part of the equation here. So when you do put those changes into place, what are we doing then to make sure that people are able to actually build an ADU, and what are the programs that are incentivizing the changes that, zoning reform really takes the first step in removing that barrier. But what are we doing then in cities to really ensure that people are able to
Are you
take the next
seeing
step there?
these policy interventions at the state level or at the local level?
I mean, I would say both. We heard a little bit about how state policy can really preempt or kind of override what we're seeing, differences in the local practices. But a lot of it is happening at the local level, where you see kind of innovative incentive programs and things like that that are really driving change.
Okay. And do you see any communities, any states or localities doing a good job, particularly the communities you serve, right? Historically marginalized communities, those who don't have that access to family wealth to go out there and buy. Do you see anybody leading in that space?
I mean, I would say that, for example, the city of Boston, they've taken some measures with their zoning reform to really add in an element of for large developments to ensure that developers are looking at their obligation to further fair housing. So there's actually a policy passed in Boston where developers have to kind of go through a assessment and determine a step that they will take to make sure that they're increasing access to people who've been historically marginalized. Now, it's a few years old. It's kind of one of the very few places where that is happening, but it's something that could be, mimicked or adapted into other places, just to make sure that we're really holding our intention of increasing access for everybody.
Interesting. Dagny, I want to go back to something you said, Dagny. You were talking about sort of the tensions between the affordability side of it, right, in the average incomes here, right? One of the challenges I think we face that often gets overlooked in the housing discussion is we have a lot of low-skill, low-paying jobs in this economy, and we have a huge market in the state next door that seems to want to cash out and come here, right? How, when you're talking to policymakers, does that come up? It seems like there's this disconnect between our sort of the state of our economy, the type of jobs we have, those that we're able to attract, and this issue of housing. Do policymakers make that linkage when you talk to them?
Well, we do. We try to. It's important. Agree. It's absolutely connected and important. And we're creating a community land trust for single-family homeownership at the county. And when we recently were presenting the program to the commission, we did exactly that. And we were talking about the different income levels in terms of, okay, well, in Clark County at 80% AMI, how much is that an hour in wages? At 80%, I think it's 33. And then what types of jobs are those, right? So who are the people that we are actually serving with these programs? And it's, I think, critically important to do that.
Yeah, so 33, that's not our average wage anywhere near that. Shawn?
The nexus of housing cost and income is a key part of this story. In our talk, we showed that Nevada became the second most renter cost burdened state in the entire US. In terms of that relative weighting of income to rent, we're in worse situation than San Francisco, New York City right now. And the thing about economic development and real estate development is I do think that oftentimes they can be siloed. And they are theoretically linked. In our urban econ classes, we talk about the wage amenity trade-off. If we look at a city and I could, have all the power in the world and drop an ocean in the middle of Las Vegas, right? A big amenity improvement. Two things happen. More people might want to sort into the city to take advantage of that amenity. And then once that happens, labor markets and housing markets go in opposite directions. More people lining up in a city, supply of labor is higher, wages go down. More people wanting to move, demand for housing goes up, prices go in the other direction. Connecting economic development to housing and perhaps thinking about things in terms of the housing economy matters vitally, because if we don't think about ways to create policies that can nudge, and by the way, economic development too, at its core is really about commercial real estate development. Where do we place workers? Where do we place firms? How do we attract them? How do we market our landscape for logistics centers and warehouses? But doing so meaningfully to think about the nexus of wages, rents, and home prices matters. if we, right, the types of industries we want to bring in, want to be thinking very carefully, not just about getting more business, but having businesses that can support high wages so that we can create a stable equilibrium between what's happening in the housing market and what's happening in the market for employment.
And then how much of our, I know you touched on it in your presentation, but our unique situation with the California issue here, how much of price is being driven by that?
So Nick and I were frankly quite surprised. So just for some context, tracking migration patterns is very difficult. The census uses a survey. Redfin, you might see their migration statistics. If you read the fine print, it's actually just based on search interest, not actual movers. Who has more of an incentive to track you than perhaps anyone in the US? The Internal Revenue Service. We look at tax returns because we can track someone based on their address across these tax returns. And the key stat to remember is that I think we estimate that 42.1% of all movers, people moving from either within Nevada property to Nevada property or from elsewhere into Nevada, is accounted for by California. But looking at the income gap, if you look at a Nevada mover, think about a local home buyer, someone that lives in Nevada, moving somewhere else in Nevada, we can track their adjusted gross income. We can also track the adjusted gross income of someone from California moving into Nevada. That gap is on average across states, 94.1% higher AGI for that California mover versus Nevada mover. It's a significant consideration.
Wow. As a former Californian, that was way back when, 2000. I want to return to, you brought out the community housing fund, right? In the land trust, trying to facilitate home ownership there. This is a relatively new thing for us, correct? Tell us how this came about and what's the potential here?
So the Community Land Trust is our program for homeownership. It's a structure that has been used across the country for decades. We decided, the County Commission really put a priority on affordable housing, dedicated a lot of funding in part because of the ARPA funding available from the federal government during COVID. And so a lot of money was earmarked for efforts to assist building more affordable rental housing. But the commission and county leadership said, well, we need to focus on home ownership as well. And so we looked at the different programs, and the Community Land Trust was really the one that we saw across the country that was the one that creates affordable home ownership that is then sustainable over generations. So this program, as homes are resold, they stay affordable so that they create an opportunity for the next low to moderate income home buyer to also own a home. So by creating this program, we hope to create a supply of affordable homes for folks that'll be around for generations to come. So it's a different model. It's very complicated. The county, as the Community Land Trust, retains ownership of the land. The homeowner owns the home. But we've got 240 homes in the pipeline using land that was county land as well as federal land. We'll also be subsidizing the homeowners so that to make sure those prices are affordable. So it's an exciting program. It's going to provide opportunities to 240 households, but also I think we hope to sort of change the culture around that discussion, right? We think we may be the first land trust in the country to be building on a whole subdivision scale. We're starting really big. And we're going to be providing, subsidies and down payment assistance. And so just to get people locally thinking about that, this may be a program that'll work, that we can create affordable homeownership, and we can assist folks in this way, and that this is something that'll benefit folks and create generational wealth in our community for generations to come.
Shawn, have you seen these work elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of the community land trust model and shared equity models in general. I think they increase the ability for people to access home ownership, access housing stability, but they also have, because of this permanent affordability element to them, they have this long-term vision of kind of being able to preserve long-term residents in a particular area, allow them to build some wealth, but also preserve the character of a neighborhood, preserve the ability for people to stay where they want to live, and have that impact over generations. And I think that's something that we need to infuse in a lot of the ways that we do, not just home ownership, but other types of affordable housing, is really thinking about that. longer than 30-year affordability period, right? Because 30 years goes by fast, and especially in the homeownership space. And so, you know, the land trust model has been really successful. I mean, I really commend you all for the scale that you're starting this with. That's huge. And in some places, it's really starting small, but to have something at the subdivision level in the hundreds like that is going to be really transformational. And I'm sure it will continue to grow.
That's right. I want to switch gears a little bit here. And last panel, I know the question about politics on the campaign trail. So one of the things we've heard about on the campaign trail has been the corporate ownership as being the sort of driver of all these things, taking up large chunks of the housing market, need to rein in this practice here. Are there policies that are actually feasible at doing that? I know we've talked about it, Shawn, and one of the things, you know, just finding who owns these homes is really, really hard, right? I think at one point you were digging and you guys found that every home had a separate LLC that all went back to a larger LLC. So it's a lot of detective work there. You know, is this just something that you politicians want to talk about, or are there feasible solutions out there?
You know, I don't want to get too far out of our area of expertise, which is on the data side. But on the data side, you know, measurement is challenging. It's challenging for CoreLogic, it's challenging for Redfin, it's challenging for us for the reasons you talked about. Also the narrative, you know, when we're thinking about regulating something, that before those discussions happen, I still think that there's a lot of discussion that needs to be had about what exactly does corporate investment in real estate, in residential, really do? Will it crowd out home ownership? Yes, it will. If you have a new source of demand coming into a market, that's going to create some type of crowd out effect. One angle, though, that gets often overlooked is when corporations, hedge funds, buy single-family properties, they're doing two things. One, and the most important one, is they're coming offline the owner-occupied market, and they're going online into the renter-occupied market. So you see this diverging supply effect. In fact, of the one study published to date on the topic, you actually see an asymmetric response on home price versus rents. Corporate investment in single family, what we know right now, seems to lead to somewhat downward pressure on existing single family rents, but somewhat upward pressure on existing single-family home prices. And so not thinking about the full narrative around corporate investment is going to potentially skew what we think about what the right regulatory framework is. And in my opinion, I think the research is vastly underdeveloped in terms of what is going on in the marketplace right now.
Shawn, do you see anything nationally on this front?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that completely. I think that it starts with having better data about the types of institutional investors we have in communities. I mean, we have some that have hundreds of properties, some that have thousands of properties, and the policy solutions or the interventions are going to be different depending on what level of kind of investment and what their interests are in communities. And to your point earlier, the spatial analysis of where these are and what the effects that has in communities and what interventions can really work. So, I mean, I would say starting with things like mandatory rental registries that some communities have done where they have high investor or high rental flip from single family rental can be a way to address that. And that's happened in, you know, across New York State. I know Baltimore has a registry of that sort. Implementing first look periods. So, you know, when you think about this issue too, I mean, it really came out of the foreclosure crisis and all of the kind of shuffling of these single-family properties into corporate investors. And so a lot of the same solutions that we talked about 15 years ago around ensuring that homeowners and nonprofits and tenant opportunity to purchase policies are able to, you know, make other entities besides corporate investors competitive are still going to be part of the solution here, and that's really worked. We've also seen, like in Cincinnati, for example, you may have heard of the Port project in Cincinnati, where they purchased competitively used public bonds to purchase about 200 properties that had been foreclosed by an investor and kind of fought out other entities, other corporate entities that were looking to purchase those and put those back into the affordable homeownership pipeline in Cincinnati. So there are small scale examples of kind of different ways to to really make other entities competitive. But things like putting taxes or financial penalties on large-scale investors who have, say, 50 or 100 more properties, we haven't really seen that happen. There's been proposals, but that hasn't really been something that we've seen widely adopted. And so that's something that I think we still need to explore as an option and policy option.
Yeah, if it would hold up in the courts. Dagny, do you hear these conversations?
Yeah, and I don't know if I have much to add, except that we know definitely on the homeownership front that it impacts the market and opportunities for homeownership, and just that we're hearing a lot of conversations here in state about what is the solution. So.
Yeah. Last question I want to ask is about foreclosures. Right, we're running high, but as your data shows, right, it's geographically intense in some areas. In other areas, it's not much of an issue there. So how does this, knowing this, how does this affect the type of tools that policymakers can implement to deal with the foreclosure crisis? Is it very micro-targeted? Is it some sort of arbitration process? What's the best path forward for us?
Based on what Nick and I know from our report, we have no evidence of systemic increases in mortgage default at all. We're still at historically low levels. We do have evidence, like you said, as you alluded to, that there are key hotspot neighborhoods in town that are seeing concentrations of mortgage default, notice of default, foreclosure activity. And that, again, I'm not the policymaker, but that would lead me to conclude that thinking about homeowner-targeted specific programs to help, as a first stage, educate, inform, and provide what tools are out there for homeowners to avoid and what to be doing to manage their home finances seems to be like a fairly low cost. That's where I would start. But again, I'm not the expert in the policy space. We just look at the data.
Shawn, do you see anything nationally that's working in this space?
I think it's exactly what you've come to the same conclusion about. It's really investing in sustainable homeownership on the front end, but then also having these post-purchase counseling, investing in housing counseling programs, investing in programs that can really help existing home buyers or homeowners maintain their homes. And so what are we also doing in the refinance space? What are we doing in ensuring that HELOCs and other types of funds to keep homes, keep people to be able to stay in their homes for other reasons viable. And on the financing side for that can honestly be a huge problem. And so those are the types of things that we really have to pay attention to.
Anything the county's doing in this space?
I can just speak to, from our Community Land Trust, all the research that we've done. What we learned is that nationally, during the foreclosure crisis, Community Land Trust had a lower rate of foreclosure across the country. And the reason for that is because there's so much support in those programs for homeowners. So that's something we've put in place in our Community Land Trust program, that we're requiring home buyer education courses, and then also post-purchase requiring homeowner education, and then ongoing communication and support for those homeowners, and then notifications if any of those homeowners are delinquent so that we can immediately work with them, choosing lenders that also have programs and support in place. We also have a foreclosure mitigation fund specific to that program that we put in place. So we've got sort of a belt and suspenders approach to really make sure we're supporting those homeowners. But I do know also that Nevada, during the foreclosure crisis, developed a pretty robust infrastructure for, to help homeowners, because we were the hardest hit. So I know the state, and there were a lot of local organizations. So, that's over a decade ago, but there was a lot of infrastructure built, specifically in Nevada during that time.
All right, I think we're going to leave it there. You guys have been a wonderful audience. We want to thank you for your patience and for your attention today. I also want to thank all of our participants today who just did a wonderful job giving a sense of all the dimensions and all the challenges facing housing. So thank you. So what we just to review here, college professor, that's how we enter lectures. We look at got some cutting edge research coming out here. Got the first look at this, capturing some of these challenges here. You've had some in-depth panel discussions on both the finance side and on the access side here. So just for those of you working in this space, our policymakers, you may not be here, but may watch this video. Right, the research presented today and the panel discussions provide a lot of insight into how to move forward on some policy recommendations. And everybody who was involved today should be looked at as a resource for policymakers and housing advocates as we address these issues. So thank you again, and everybody enjoy your afternoon.